The aperture on your camera's lens gets wider and smaller, controlling how much light gets in, a lot like the iris of your eye. When it gets darker, your iris gets larger to let more light in, and when it gets brighter, it gets smaller to let less light in. Back and forth depending on the light situation. Your camera can do this automatically, or you can control it yourself to let in more or less light depending on what you'd like to do with your photo. Let's take a look at what the aperture looks like in your lens. So here we can see the different numbers on the side of my lens here are the aperture settings. So this lens goes from 16 or f16 all the way to f1.4, and you can stop it at any of these points to get a larger or smaller aperture. So remember that a smaller aperture, a smaller opening, is a larger number. So 16 is as small as this lens will go, and that is this size right here. See the hole in the middle? That is a size 16 aperture on this lens. And 1.4 is as large as it will go. So if I move this lever, I can show you as wide as this lens will get open. That's as wide as it'll go. So clearly, if the shutter goes off and the aperture is at 16, the smaller size, I'm going to have less light coming in on my photo. And if when the shutter goes off on my camera, it's all the way at 1.4, then I'm going to have a lot more light coming in on the photo. And I can stop it at any one of those areas along the way so that I can control how much light is coming in. Other than letting in more or less light, another reason why you'd want to manually control your aperture is because it can do this really cool thing with your depth of field. Using a wider aperture will allow you to have selective focus, like on this leaf here. So when I took this photo of a leaf, I was at aperture 1.4, which is as wide as it would go for this lens. As I got smaller and smaller, when I went down to f4, now you can see there's more in focus. F8, even more is in focus. F16, which is as small as my lens will let me go, and now a lot of the photo is in focus. An easy way to remember how this works with your depth of field is to think about it this way. Aperture 4 means that you'll probably only have 4 leaves in focus, whereas aperture 16 means that you'll have 16 leaves in focus. Those aren't exact numbers, of course, but it's an easy way to remember that the smaller the number, the fewer things that you'll have in focus in the photo. And the larger the number, the more things you'll have in focus in your photo. Shutter speed is really simple. It is the speed of your shutter. It's how long your shutter is open, letting light into your camera. You can control 2 really important things with your shutter speed. One is how much light you let in, and 2 is how you freeze action. Take a look at this picture of this dog, for example. This was probably taken with a really fast shutter speed, and we can tell because all the water droplets around the dog's face are frozen in the air, and the dog's face itself is also frozen in that shaking expression. His lips sort of flying up in the air. Everything is frozen right in place, even though we know that the dog is moving really quickly. So when you have really fast action, like a shaking dog or a running or jumping person, if you use a really fast shutter speed too, you'll be able to freeze that action. Here's another case, a man water skiing. He's frozen, and so is this wave up behind him. All the little parts of the wave are frozen in the air. This was another really fast shutter speed. In another example with water, you see all the droplets are frozen right in the air. If we were looking at this with the naked eye, we would just see streams of water coming out. But here we get to capture the action with a super fast shutter speed. In this case, the photographer used a slower shutter speed, which means that the shutter was open long enough to have this woman walk by with this hospital bed and she's a blur. Here's another case where a slower shutter speed shows that the water is flowing. If this were a fast shutter speed like the first few photos we looked at, all the water would be frozen in the air. With a slowed down shutter speed, in this case we get sort of a lacy effect with the water. And here's another case of a really long shutter speed. Imagine if this had been taken really quickly. All we would see is a bunch of dots from the headlights and taillights of these cars, because they would be frozen in place. But with a really long shutter speed, the cars have been allowed to go by while the shutter was open, so we get these streaking headlights and taillights. Okay, so shutter speed. Let's review. A really fast shutter speed lets in less light and freezes the action. And a really slow shutter speed lets in a lot more light and lets the action show up on the photo in a blur. But sometimes all you want is a really nice crisp photo of a person or a plant or whatever it is in front of you. And sometimes that photo turns out blurry and you're not sure why. Well, one reason could be because your shutter speed is too slow. Here's a good example. You can see that this doll is not in focus. Well, actually my lens was perfectly focused on the doll, but my hand was moving as I pressed the shutter, and I was using a shutter speed that was too slow. So a slow shutter speed is going to record the motion of my hands as I press the shutter, and as you see, turn out sort of blurry photo. I shot this at 1/30th of a second, and that is too slow for a handheld photo. Now if I'd had a tripod, that'd be another story because my camera wouldn't be moving at all. Now this one I shot at 1/60th of a second. You can see that the doll is much more crisp in this photo, and my hand was probably still moving as much as it was in the first photo, but 1/60th of a second is just fast enough to freeze the photo. So what is fast enough and what is too slow? Generally, 1/60th of a second is as slow as you want to go when you're holding your camera in your hands and you don't have a tripod. Now that changes when you zoom in. If you're zooming in to 90 millimeters, you instead need to go a little bit faster to 1/90th of a second. If you're zooming in to 200 millimeters, you want to try to shoot at 1/200th of a second. These aren't exact numbers, of course, but they are a good rule to follow if you want to make sure that you freeze the action in your photo. Alright, so we've already talked about the aperture, which is the width of the opening in your camera. So you can let in more or less light by making the opening wider or smaller. We've talked about the shutter speed, which is the speed of your shutter, or how long your shutter's open on your camera. You can let in more or less light by opening your shutter longer or for a shorter amount of time. And the third variable here is ISO. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So if you're out on a bright sunny day like these two people on the beach, there's plenty of light out. It's bouncing off the sand, it's everywhere, it's intense. You don't need a very high ISO. In other words, you don't need your camera to be very sensitive to light because there's a lot of light. And if your camera is very sensitive to it, then you'll probably have way too much. And the other parts of your exposure will be affected, like your shutter speed and your aperture. You'll have to have a super fast shutter speed and a super small aperture to make up for that really high sensitivity. So on really bright days like this, you can use a low ISO. In fact, you probably want to put it as low as your camera can go. Usually that's somewhere between 80 and 200 ISO. Same with any other sunny day like this. You're out in the country, it's broad daylight, everything is bright, you can probably use the lowest ISO on your camera. Now if you're shooting in a darker situation and you don't want to use a flash and you don't want to use your tripod, that's when you want to use a higher ISO. This photo was shot at ISO 1600. Here's another example. I took this monkey photo in the jungle in Bali where there was a lot of shade and I wanted to expose him just right, so I used a higher ISO to make my camera more sensitive to light because there wasn't very much light available. One thing you do have to watch out for with ISO is that generally with a higher ISO, you'll have more noise in your photo when you view it at 100%. So just be careful when you're shooting that your ISO is as low as it can go for the scene that you're shooting and for the effect that you want.
Whether you've got a mobile phone camera, point and click, or full digital SLR, you can improve your photographs with two simple rules. Here's your viewfinder or LCD screen. Divide the scene up into thirds horizontally. It could be lines of trees or hills. Also divide it vertically. This could be tree trunks, flowers, people. Put the two together and you get a grid. Where the grid lines meet should be the focus of your photograph, not in the middle as most people do. Here I am, placed on the grid line on the left. I have plenty of space to move into psychologically. This doesn't work. I look too squashed. Here's better. I have room to breathe, and psychologically people will prefer this photograph almost regardless of what the background is. If you reverse me and place me here, do you think that works as well? Or would I be better over on this grid line? What do you think? This squashes me. I'm better here. Again, space to move into, space to breathe. That's for landscape format. It works exactly the same for portrait. Here's a subject placed on the grid line. So that's the rule of thirds. Lead-in lines also add to your photographs. It's simple really. It's a line that leads the eye into your photograph, often from bottom left in. It can work from bottom right, and actually left-handers prefer this, but a lot of people prefer bottom right. You can have zigzags as well. This could be roads, lines of trees, flowers, people, rocks, anything that forms a pattern across the scene that you are taking. So let's see if you can apply the rule of thirds and lead-in lines to some photographs I've taken.